Winchester rifle cracked against the dusty air, its echo bouncing off the canyon walls like thunder trapped in stone. Blood trickled down Caleb Morrison's weathered face as he pressed his back against the overturned wagon, counting the remaining bullets in his belt. 6 shots left. 7 men still breathing on the other side of those rocks. But this wasn't about numbers anymore. This was about the 20-year-old woman crouched beside him, her emerald eyes wide with terror, clutching her 4-year-old son against her chest like a shield made of flesh and bone. This was about doing what needed to be done. Consequences be damned. 12 hours earlier, Caleb had been nursing his morning coffee on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the Montana Territory in shades of gold and amber. At 32, his hands already carried the permanent stains of a lifetime spent working cattle, his face etched with lines that spoke of too many seasons under an unforgiving sun. The war had ended 8 years ago, but some battles never truly finish. They just change locations. The sound of approaching hoofbeats had broken the morning silence. Not the steady rhythm of a single rider, but the chaotic drumming of multiple horses moving fast. Trouble always announced itself that way in these parts. Caleb set down his cup and reached for the rifle propped against the porch railing. Through the heat shimmer rising from the valley floor, he could make out a wagon racing toward his property, dust billowing behind it like smoke from a prairie fire. Even from a distance, he could see the desperation in the way the driver snapped the reins, urging every last ounce of speed from the exhausted horses. Behind the wagon, gaining ground with each passing second, rode 6 men. Their intentions were written in the way they leaned forward in their saddles, in the glint of metal catching the morning light, in the predatory patience of wolves closing in on wounded prey. Caleb moved with the fluid efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury that could cost lives. He saddled his bay gelding in less than 2 minutes, checking his ammunition as muscle memory guided his hands through preparations he had made too many times before. The Spencer repeating rifle felt familiar against his palm, its weight both comforting and ominous. He spurred his horse down the slope, intercepting the wagon just as it crested a low ridge. The driver was a young woman, her dark hair whipping around her face as she fought to control the panicked horses. Beside her sat a small boy, his knuckles white as he gripped the wagon seat. The woman's dress, once a pale blue, was now stained with dust and what looked suspiciously like dried blood on the sleeve. Her name was Evangeline Hartwell, though Caleb wouldn't learn this until later. All he saw in that moment was terror incarnate, a woman pushed beyond the limits of endurance, running on nothing but maternal instinct and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might offer sanctuary. The pursuing riders were closer now, close enough that Caleb could make out individual faces beneath the shadow of their hat brims. He recognized the type immediately: drifters and desperados, men who had found that the lawless territories offered opportunities for those willing to take what they wanted by force. Their leader, a lean man with a scarred jaw and eyes like chips of flint, raised his hand to signal the others. Caleb positioned his horse between the wagon and its pursuers, his rifle held ready across his saddle horn. The woman's eyes met his for a split second, and in that brief contact, he saw something that made his decision for him. Not just fear, but a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of a mother wolf defending her den. This wasn't a woman running from her own mistakes. This was someone protecting something precious. The lead rider called out, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "Move along, stranger. This ain't your concern." Caleb's response was quiet, almost conversational, but his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I'm making it my concern." The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. 7 men against 1, with a woman and child caught in the crossfire. The mathematics were simple enough, but Caleb had learned during his years in blue uniform that mathematics rarely told the whole story. Sometimes the fight wasn't about winning. Sometimes it was about buying time, creating space, giving innocence a chance to survive. The first shot came from the scarred man's pistol, a wild thing fired more in frustration than with any real aim. Caleb's response was measured and precise, the Spencer rifle speaking with authority. The bullet took the leader in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around in his saddle before he toppled to the ground. What followed was chaos distilled into its purest form. The remaining riders scattered, seeking cover behind rocks and scrub brush, their horses wheeling and snorting as gunfire erupted across the peaceful morning. Caleb dismounted, using his horse's body as a shield while he worked the rifle's lever action, each shot carefully placed to keep the attackers pinned down rather than expose himself to the return fire. "Get behind those rocks," he shouted to the woman, gesturing toward a cluster of boulders that offered better protection than the open wagon. She needed no encouragement, gathering her son in her arms and running in a crouch toward the makeshift fortress. The battle that followed lasted nearly an hour, a grinding test of ammunition and patience. The bandits had numbers, but Caleb had position and experience. He moved constantly, never firing twice from the same location, using the terrain to his advantage in ways that spoke of hard-won knowledge. Each shot was precious, each movement calculated to preserve life while taking it when necessary. One by one, the odds shifted. A bandit attempting to flank their position took a bullet through the thigh and retreated, cursing and bleeding. Another, grown impatient with the siege, charged their position only to discover that desperation was no substitute for tactics. By the time the sun reached its zenith, 3 men lay still on the rocky ground, and the survivors had lost their appetite for whatever prize had driven them to this remote corner of Montana territory. The retreat, when it came, was as sudden as the initial attack. The remaining bandits gathered their wounded and melted back into the wilderness like morning mist before a rising sun, leaving behind only the acrid smell of gunpowder and the copper tang of blood on the wind. In the silence that followed, Caleb became aware of his own breathing, harsh and rapid in the thin air. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands trembling slightly from the after-effects of sustained combat. But he was alive, and more importantly, so were the woman and her child. He found them huddled behind the largest boulder, the woman's arms wrapped protectively around her son. The boy couldn't have been more than 4 years old, his face streaked with tears and dust, his small body pressed against his mother as if he could disappear into her embrace. The woman looked up as Caleb approached, and he saw that her fear had been replaced by something else entirely, a mixture of gratitude and assessment that spoke of a sharp intelligence behind those green eyes. "Are you hurt?" Caleb asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The question seemed inadequate given what they had just endured, but it was a place to start. She shook her head, though he noticed she favored her left arm. No, we're... Thank you." The words came out in a rush, as if she couldn't quite believe they were still breathing. "I don't know how to... They would have killed us." Caleb knelt beside them, his experienced eyes taking inventory of visible injuries. The blood on her sleeve was from a shallow cut, probably sustained during her desperate flight rather than from the recent gunfight. The boy appeared unharmed, though his eyes held that peculiar 1,000-yard stare that Caleb had seen too often in the faces of children who had witnessed violence. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked, gentling his voice in the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "Evangeline Hartwell." She shifted her son to her other arm, wincing slightly at the movement. "This is Tommy. We were traveling to Silver Creek when they ... She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Caleb nodded. He had heard enough similar stories to fill in the gaps. The territories were full of people running from something. Failed dreams, violent pasts, or in this case, likely the death of a husband that had left a young woman vulnerable to men who viewed such vulnerability as opportunity. "How far were you planning to travel today?" he asked, Evangeline looked toward the horizon, where Silver Creek lay hidden beyond rolling hills and pine forests. "We hope to reach town by nightfall. I have had arrangements." The past tense carried weight, suggesting that whatever plans she had made were now complicated by the morning's events. Caleb studied the damaged wagon. One wheel was cracked, the axle bent from the desperate flight across rough terrain. The horses were exhausted, their sides heaving and flecked with foam. Even if the bandits didn't return, continuing the journey in this condition would be tantamount to suicide. "My ranch is about 3 miles south," he said, making a decision that felt both inevitable and dangerous. "You and the boy can rest there. Get cleaned up. We can see about fixing your wagon tomorrow." Something flickered across Evangeline's face, an emotion too complex to name. Gratitude warred with caution, desperation with pride. She was clearly a woman accustomed to making her own decisions, but circumstances had stripped away most of her options. "I don't want to impose," she said, though the words lacked conviction. "You've already done so much. It's no imposition." Caleb stood, extending his hand to help her to her feet. Besides, those men might circle back once they lick their wounds. Better to be somewhere defensible than caught in the open. The truth of this statement was written in the way she immediately gathered her son closer. Whatever had driven her to this desperate flight across the Montana Territory, the threat was far from over. The morning's violence had been a battle, not the war. The journey to Caleb's ranch passed in relative silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on packed earth. Tommy had fallen asleep in his mother's arms, exhaustion finally overcoming the trauma of the morning. Evangeline rode beside Caleb on the wagon seat, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Caleb's ranch spread across a natural valley, protected on 3 sides by steep hills and watered by a clear stream that meandered through stands of cottonwood and pine. The house itself was modest but well built, constructed from local stone and timber with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of a man planning to stay. A barn, corral, and several outbuildings completed the picture of a working cattle operation. As they approached the main house, Caleb noticed the way Evangeline took in every detail: the solid construction, the well-maintained fences, the small touches that transformed a simple dwelling into something approaching a home. Her assessment was thorough and professional, like someone evaluating not just shelter, but possibility. "You built all this yourself?" she asked as he helped her down from the wagon. "Most of it." Caleb lifted the sleeping boy carefully, surprised by how natural the weight felt in his arms. "Been working on it for about 5 years now. Still not finished, probably never will be." Inside, the house reflected its owner. Functional but comfortable, with handmade furniture and shelves lined with books that suggested interests beyond cattle ranching. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with a few carefully chosen items that hinted at a past Caleb rarely discussed. Evangeline's eyes lingered on a faded daguerreotype of a woman in uniform, but she didn't ask questions. "There's a room upstairs where you and the boy can rest," Caleb said, setting Tommy gently on the sofa. "I'll see about getting some food together." But Evangeline was already moving toward the kitchen, her movements quick and efficient despite her obvious exhaustion. "Let me help. It's the least I can do." What followed was an oddly domestic scene. 2 strangers moving around each other in the confined space of the kitchen as if they had been doing so for years. Evangeline proved to be remarkably competent, transforming simple ingredients into a meal that filled the house with the kind of warmth that had been absent since Caleb had built the place. As they ate, pieces of her story began to emerge. She had been married to a man named David Hartwell, a merchant who had died of fever 6 months earlier, leaving her with debts and enemies she hadn't known existed. The journey to Silver Creek had been an attempt to start fresh, to build something for her son in a place where her husband's mistakes couldn't follow. "Those men this morning," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "They weren't random bandits, were they?" Caleb looked up from his plate, seeing the intelligence behind the question. "No, I don't think they were." She nodded, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "David borrowed money from some very dangerous people. I hoped that his death would end it." Apparently, they see things differently. The implications hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. If the morning's attackers had been debt collectors rather than simple thieves, they wouldn't give up easily. Evangeline had bought herself time with her desperate flight, but time was a finite resource, and hers was running out. As evening settled over the valley, Caleb found himself studying his unexpected guests with growing concern. Tommy had awakened long enough to eat before curling up in front of the fireplace, his small body finally relaxing into genuine rest. Evangeline sat beside him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder even in sleep. She was beautiful, Caleb acknowledged to himself, but it was a beauty tempered by hardship and responsibility. Her hands showed the signs of work, her dress was practical rather than fashionable, and her eyes held the kind of wariness that came from learning that the world was not always a safe place for young women alone. "You can't go to Silver Creek," he said finally, giving voice to the conclusion he had been reluctant to reach. Evangeline looked up from her contemplation of the fire. "Why not?" "Because they'll be watching for you there. Men like that, they think ahead. They'll have someone waiting, probably someone who looks respectable. Someone who can ask questions without drawing attention." The truth of this settled over her like a cold wind. She had been running toward what she thought was safety. But safety was an illusion when your enemies had resources and patience. Then where do I go? The question was asked quietly, but Caleb heard the desperation underneath. This was a woman who had exhausted most of her options before the morning's violence had eliminated the rest. Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Not the chaotic drumming of a chase this time, but the measured approach of a single rider. Caleb was on his feet instantly, his rifle in hand, but the visitor announced himself with a familiar whistle that identified him as Jake Summers, Caleb's nearest neighbor. Jake was a weathered man in his 50s, a former cavalryman who had settled in the territory after the war. His ranch lay 10 miles to the east, and his visits were infrequent enough to suggest that this one carried particular significance. "Evening, Caleb," Jake said as he dismounted, his eyes taking in the damaged wagon and the obvious signs of recent conflict. "Heard some shooting earlier. Everything all right?" Caleb made quick introductions, sketching out the morning's events without going into details about Evangeline's situation. Jake listened with the practiced attention of a man who had learned to read between lines, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Those men you describe," he said finally, "they sound like the group that's been working the territory south of here. Professional troublemakers, if you catch my meaning. The kind that don't give up easy." This confirmed Caleb's worst suspicions. Professional debt collectors were infinitely more dangerous than simple bandits because they had backing, resources, and most importantly, persistence. They would keep coming until they recovered what they believed was owed, or until someone made it clear that the cost of collection exceeded the value of the debt. "There's something else," Jake continued, his voice dropping. "Word is they've got backing from someone with real money, someone who can afford to keep them on retainer. This isn't just about collecting what's owed anymore. It's become about setting an example." The implication was clear. Evangeline wasn't just running from debt collectors anymore. She had become a symbol, a test case that would determine how seriously future debtors would take their obligations. Her escape represented a crack in someone's authority, and cracks had to be sealed before they became breaks. As Jake prepared to leave, he pulled Caleb aside for a private word. "That young woman and her boy, they're in serious danger. More than you might realize. These aren't the kind of men who'll be discouraged by a single defeat." Caleb nodded, though Jake's warning only confirmed what he had already concluded. "Any suggestions?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering options that probably included advising Caleb to distance himself from trouble he hadn't asked for. But when he spoke, his words carried the weight of shared military service and mutual respect. There's a wagon train forming up in Bozeman, heading for Oregon Territory. Families mostly, good people looking for new starts. They could use someone with medical knowledge, and from what I can see, your guest has the look of someone with education. It was a lifeline, no one that came with its own risks. Oregon Territory was far enough away to represent genuine escape, but the journey would take months and expose Evangeline and Tommy to dangers that made debt collectors seem almost trivial by comparison. After Jake left, Caleb found Evangeline still sitting by the fire, though Tommy had been moved to a makeshift bed on the sofa. She looked up as he entered, and he saw that she had been crying, though she had wiped away the evidence. "I heard," she said simply, "about the wagon train." Caleb settled into the chair across from her, suddenly aware of how the day's events had altered the comfortable isolation he had built around himself. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been a small herd of cattle that had wandered too far from water. Now he was harboring refugees and planning escapes like some character from a dime novel. "It's not a perfect solution," he admitted. "The trail to Oregon is dangerous. People die. And if I stay?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to fully examine. If she stayed, she would remain a target, and anyone who helped her would become one as well. But if she left, she would be trading known dangers for unknown ones, risking her son's life on the uncertain hope of finding sanctuary 2,000 miles away. "If you stay," Caleb said carefully, "those men will keep coming. And next time, they'll bring more help." Evangeline stared into the fire, watching flames dance across split logs with the hypnotic intensity of someone trying to divine the future from flickering light. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a resolution that hadn't been there before. "Then we go to Oregon." The decision, once made, seemed to release some tension that had been building throughout the evening. Plans began to take shape with surprising speed. They would leave for Bozeman in 3 days, giving them time to repair the wagon and gather supplies. Caleb would escort them to town, ostensibly to conduct business but actually to ensure they reached the wagon train safely. It was a reasonable plan, one that acknowledged both the immediate danger and the practical limitations of their situation. What it didn't account for was the way fate sometimes imposed its own timeline on human intentions. The attack came at dawn. Caleb woke to the sound of Tommy whimpering, a soft distress that cut through the early morning stillness like a blade through silk. His hand found the Spencer rifle before his eyes fully opened, muscle memory guiding him through the transition from sleep to alertness that had kept him alive through 4 years of war and 8 years of frontier living. The first gray light of morning filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the main room where Evangeline and her son had spent the night. Tommy sat upright on the makeshift bed, his small hands pressed against his ears as if trying to block out sounds that existed only in his dreams. Evangeline knelt beside him, her voice a soothing whisper as she tried to calm terrors that had followed them into sleep. "Mama, they're coming back," Tommy said, his voice thick with the peculiar certainty that sometimes accompanied childhood nightmares. "The bad men are coming back." From his position near the window, Caleb froze. Something in the boy's tone, a quality that went beyond simple fear, made him listen more carefully to the morning sounds filtering through the walls. The usual chorus of awakening birds was absent, replaced by a silence that felt heavy and unnatural. Moving carefully to avoid creaking floorboards, Caleb positioned himself where he could see through the window without being observed from outside. The valley spread before him in the pale dawn light, peaceful and seemingly empty. But there was something wrong with the picture, some detail that his experienced eye couldn't quite identify. Then he saw it, a reflection of metal among the rocks on the eastern ridge, visible for just an instant before disappearing again. Then another, this time from the western approach. The morning sun was betraying the positions of men who thought themselves well hidden. They had come back, but this time they had brought friends. "Get dressed quickly," Caleb said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. "We need to move." Evangeline looked up from comforting her son, immediately reading the tension in Caleb's posture. She had learned to recognize danger in the subtle shifts of expression, the way a man's shoulders set when violence became inevitable. "How many?" she asked, already helping Tommy into his clothes with practiced efficiency. "At least a dozen, maybe more." Caleb moved away from the window, gathering ammunition and supplies with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before. "They've got us surrounded." The situation was worse than he had initially thought. These weren't the same desperate men who had pursued Evangeline's wagon yesterday. This was a coordinated assault, planned and executed by professionals who understood the value of patience and overwhelming force. Through the window, Caleb could make out individual figures moving among the rocks and trees that dotted the hillsides around his ranch. They were taking their time, establishing positions, cutting off escape routes with the thoroughness of men who had done this kind of work before. Someone had invested serious money in this operation. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen," Caleb said, checking the loads in his pistols. "Stone walls, reinforced door. You and Tommy can wait there while I try to draw them away." But Evangeline was already shaking her head. "They'll burn the house. Root cellar or not, we'll be trapped." She was right, of course. Fire was the oldest siege weapon known to man, and these men would have no compunction about using it. The ranch house, for all its solid construction, was still made primarily of wood and would burn readily enough if someone was determined to see it happen. "Then we run," Caleb said, though he knew the futility of the suggestion even as he spoke it. The surrounding hills were crawling with armed men, and open ground offered no protection for a woman and child. A voice called out from the yard, carrying easily in the still morning air. It was the same man who had led yesterday's pursuit, though his tone now carried the confidence of someone holding all the advantages. "Morrison, you in there?" So they knew his name now. That suggested research, planning, and most ominously, local information. Someone in the area had been talking, providing details about his habits, his defenses, his likely reactions to various scenarios. "We know the woman's in there with you," the voice continued. "This doesn't have to go hard. Send her out and we'll let you live to regret your interference." The offer was almost certainly a lie, but it confirmed what Caleb had already suspected about their intentions. This wasn't about money anymore, if it ever had been. This was about making an example, demonstrating the consequences of interfering with certain people's business. Caleb moved to a position where his voice would carry without exposing him to sniper fire. "She's under my protection now. You'll have to go through me to get her." The response came in the form of gunfire, multiple rifles opening up simultaneously from concealed positions around the ranch. Bullets shattered windows, splintered wood, and filled the air with a deadly whisper of lids searching for flesh. Caleb threw himself flat, pulling Evangeline and Tommy down with him as the barrage continued. The initial assault lasted perhaps 2 minutes, long enough to demonstrate the futility of any attempt to leave the house. When silence finally returned, the morning air was thick with gun smoke and the acrid smell of splintered wood. Several holes in the walls allowed thin streams of sunlight to penetrate the interior, creating an almost artistic effect that belied the lethality of their situation. "New terms," the voice called out. "You've got 1 hour to think it over. After that, we start burning things." An hour. 60 minutes to find a solution to an impossible problem or watch everything end in fire and lead. Caleb had faced worse odds during the war, but never with civilians depending on his decisions. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. "There might be a way," Evangeline said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "But you're not going to like it." Caleb looked at her, seeing something in her expression that hadn't been there before. a kind of resigned determination that spoke of someone who had been preparing for this moment longer than he had realized. "I go out there," she continued. "Face them alone. Maybe I can negotiate something, buy time for Tommy to get away." "Absolutely not." The response was immediate and non-negotiable. "They'll kill you the moment you step outside." "Maybe, but if I don't, they'll kill all of us anyway." The logic was sound, but it was the kind of logic that required sacrificing everything good in the world to preserve the merely functional. Caleb had seen enough of such bargains during the war to know how they always ended. "There's another way," he said, an idea beginning to form in his mind. It was desperate, probably futile, but it had the advantage of offering active resistance rather than passive acceptance of defeat. The ranch house sat in a natural depression, protected by hills on three sides but also potentially trapped by the same terrain. However, Caleb had spent 5 years studying every inch of this valley, learning its secrets and possibilities in the way that only comes from intimate daily contact with the place. Behind the house, hidden by a grove of cottonwood trees, a narrow ravine cut back into the eastern hills. It wasn't much more than a creek bed, barely wide enough for a single person, but it offered concealment and a potential route to higher ground. More importantly, it led to a position where a single rifleman with sufficient ammunition could command the approaches to the ranch. "Can you shoot?" Caleb asked Evangeline. "Well enough." Her answer carried the confidence of someone who had learned frontier skills out of necessity rather than choice. "Then here's what we're going to do." The plan that took shape over the next 20 minutes was audacious in its simplicity. While the attackers waited for their ultimatum to expire, Caleb would use the ravine to reach the high ground behind them. From there, he could engage them from an unexpected direction, forcing them to divide their attention and possibly creating enough confusion for Evangeline and Tommy to escape. It wasn't a perfect plan. It required precise timing, considerable luck, and a willingness to accept casualties that Caleb preferred not to contemplate. But it offered action rather than surrender, and sometimes action was enough. "If this goes wrong," Caleb said as he prepared to leave, "if I don't make it back, you take Tommy and run for Jake Summers' place. Tell him what happened. He'll know what to do." Evangeline nodded, though they both knew that if the plan failed, running would likely prove academic. The men surrounding the ranch weren't the type to leave loose ends, and a woman with a small child wouldn't get far on foot across open country. The journey through the ravine took longer than Caleb had anticipated. What had seemed like a simple creek bed from a distance proved to be a maze of fallen logs, loose rocks, and thorny undergrowth that caught at clothing and made silent movement nearly impossible. By the time he reached his intended position, precious minutes had been lost. From his elevated vantage point, Caleb could see the full scope of the trap that had been laid for them. More than a dozen men were positioned around the ranch, each with a clear field of fire and good cover. They were professionals, no doubt about it, probably former soldiers who had found that their wartime skills translated well to civilian pursuits of dubious legality. The leader, the scarred man from yesterday's encounter, stood near the barn where he could observe the house while remaining protected from return fire. He held a pocket watch, checking the time with the patience of someone confident in his ultimate victory. Caleb settled into position behind a cluster of boulders, his Spencer rifle trained on the scene below. The range was long but manageable, and he had the advantage of surprise. Once he opened fire, that advantage would disappear quickly, but it might be enough to tip the balance in favor of survival. The attack began precisely on schedule. Caleb watched the leader raise his hand, saw the responding movement among the hidden gunmen, and knew that the hour of negotiation had ended. What came next would be decided by speed, accuracy, and the kind of luck that favored neither side consistently. The first shot came from his rifle, carefully aimed and deliberately placed. The leader spun and fell, his pocket watch spinning away into the dust as he clutched his shoulder. The second shot took another man in the leg, sending him stumbling toward cover while his companions tried to locate this new threat. For perhaps 30 seconds, Caleb held the initiative. His elevated position and the element of surprise allowed him to engage targets while they struggled to locate his muzzle flashes. Among the rocks and shadows, 2 more men went down, and the coordinated assault began to dissolve into confusion as the attackers found themselves caught between the defensive fire from the house and this unexpected attack from their rear. But professional soldiers adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Within minutes, half the force had reoriented to deal with Caleb's position, while the remainder continued their assault on the ranch house. The volume of fire directed toward his hiding place increased dramatically, forcing him to keep his head down and severely limiting his ability to provide effective covering fire. Through gaps in the boulder field, he could see muzzle flashes from the house windows as Evangeline added her own contribution to the defense. She was a better shot than her modest claim had suggested, her bullets finding their marks with a consistency that spoke of considerable practice. But 2 defenders, no matter how skilled, couldn't hold off a dozen attackers indefinitely. The tide of battle began to turn when one of the attackers managed to work his way close enough to the house to throw a burning brand onto the roof. The dry wooden shingles caught immediately, sending flames dancing across the structure that had taken Caleb years to build. Smoke began to pour from the interior, making accurate shooting increasingly difficult for the defenders. It was then that Tommy's nightmare proved prophetic in ways no one could have anticipated. The child's voice, clear and penetrating despite the chaos of gunfire, could be heard calling out positions of attackers that he could see from his hiding place in the root cellar. His young eyes, unencumbered by adult assumptions about what was possible, spotted movements and threats that had escaped both Caleb and his mother. Behind the water trough, Tommy called out, his voice somehow carrying above the noise of battle. 2 men with rifles. Evangeline's rifle spoke immediately, and one of the hidden attackers pitched forward, his weapon clattering uselessly to the ground. The accuracy of the information was uncanny, as if the boy possessed some supernatural ability to see through concealment and deception. From his position on the hillside, Caleb began to understand what was happening. Tommy wasn't using supernatural sight, but rather the kind of acute observation that children sometimes possessed when their survival depended on noticing details that adults missed. The boy was reading patterns in the movement of grass, shadows that didn't belong, reflections from metal that betrayed hidden positions. Working together, separated by hundreds of yards but united by desperate necessity, Caleb and Evangeline began to systematically reduce the attacking force. Each shot was precious, each target carefully chosen for maximum effect. The burning roof continued to spread flames throughout the house, but the withering defensive fire was beginning to tell on men who had expected an easy victory. The turning point came when Caleb managed to work his way to a new position that allowed him to enfilade the attacker's main line of advance. His rifle began speaking with mechanical precision, each shot forcing the remaining men to choose between advancing into certain death or retreating to positions that offered less cover but greater distance from the deadly crossfire. One by one, the professional soldiers made the calculation that survival trumped whatever payment they had been promised. The retreat began as a grudging withdrawal but quickly became a rout as men discovered that their carefully planned assault had become a trap of their own making. By the time silence returned to the valley, 6 men lay still on the ground around the ranch house, and the survivors were disappearing into the distance with the haste of those who had learned that some prices were too high to pay. The immediate threat was over, but Caleb knew that this victory was temporary at best. The house continued to burn despite their efforts to control the flames. What had taken years to build was being consumed in minutes, reducing dreams and possibilities to ash and blackened timbers. But they were alive, and in the harsh mathematics of frontier survival, that was the only calculation that ultimately mattered. As Caleb made his way back down the ravine, he could see Evangeline and Tommy standing in the yard, watching their temporary refuge disappear in smoke and flame. The woman's face was streaked with soot and tears, but her shoulders were straight and her chin raised with the kind of defiance that had carried her through the morning's ordeal. "The barn's intact," she called out as he approached, "and the well. We can salvage something." Her practical assessment of the situation impressed him almost as much as her courage under fire had. Here was a woman who could face the destruction of shelter and safety with the same composed determination she had shown while trading gunfire with professional killers. "They'll be back," Caleb said, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious needed to be acknowledged. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll be back. I know." Evangeline watched a section of roof collapse in a shower of sparks and burning debris. "That's why we need to leave. Tonight." The decision was inevitable, though it meant abandoning everything Caleb had built in favor of an uncertain future on the Oregon Trail. But as he watched Tommy help his mother gather their few possessions from the ruins, he realized that some things were more valuable than property, more important than the dreams of a solitary man who had thought himself content with isolation. The journey to Bozeman took 3 days through country that seemed designed to test the resolve of anyone foolish enough to traverse it. Caleb rode point, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit, while Evangeline handled the repaired wagon with a competence that spoke of hard-won experience. Tommy sat beside his mother, his young face grave with the premature seriousness that violence sometimes imposed on children. They traveled mostly at night, using moonlight and starshine to navigate roads that were little more than suggestions carved into an indifferent landscape. During the day, they rested in hidden camps, taking turns standing watch while the others caught what sleep they could manage. It was a grinding routine that wore at nerves already frayed by constant vigilance. On the second night, as they crested a ridge that offered a view back toward the valley where Caleb's ranch had been, Evangeline finally spoke the words that had been haunting all their thoughts. "I'm sorry about your home. Everything you built, everything you lost because of us." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant glow that marked where his house had once stood. The fire had burned for 2 days, consuming not just the structure, but 5 years of solitary dreams and carefully laid plans. "A man builds a house for a reason," he said finally. "Maybe the reason I built mine was so I'd be there when you needed help." "Do you really believe that?" Evangeline asked. "I'm starting to." They reached Bozeman as dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The town bustled with barely controlled chaos that marked frontier settlements during the height of westward migration. Wagons lined the main street, their canvas covers bright in the morning light, while families made final preparations for the journey to Oregon Territory. The wagon master was a grizzled veteran named Samuel Harrison, whose weathered face and careful eyes suggested experience with moving large groups across hostile territory. He listened to Caleb's carefully edited version of their story with professional attention that missed very little. "You say there might be men following you?" Harrison asked. "It's possible." Caleb chose his words carefully, aware that an entire wagon train's safety could depend on this man's decision. Harrison studied Evangeline and Tommy with the assessing gaze of someone who had learned to read character quickly. What he saw apparently satisfied him because he nodded slowly. "We've got room for a woman with medical knowledge and a man who knows how to handle trouble. Question is, are you prepared for what this journey's going to cost you?" "We're prepared," Evangeline said, though Caleb noticed the slight tremor in her voice. They joined the wagon train that afternoon, taking their place in a line of vehicles that stretched for nearly a mile. Families from a dozen different states had gathered here, united by shared dreams and desperate hope that somewhere beyond the mountains lay the kind of life that seemed impossible in the places they were leaving behind. For 3 weeks, they traveled together across country that ranged from merely difficult to actively hostile. River crossings tested both equipment and courage, while mountain passes challenged the endurance of both animals and people. Through it all, Caleb found himself watching Evangeline with growing admiration as she proved herself capable of handling whatever challenges the trail presented. She doctored sick children and delivered babies, set broken bones and treated infections with a combination of medical knowledge and intuitive understanding that suggested formal training. She also proved adept at the 100 small tasks that kept a wagon train functioning, cooking over open fires, mending clothes and equipment, even standing watch when circumstances required additional sentries. But it was her relationship with Tommy that revealed the depth of her character. Despite the hardships of trail life, despite constant uncertainty about what lay ahead, she maintained the kind of patient, nurturing presence that allowed her son to begin healing from witnessed trauma. Slowly, day by day, the boy's natural curiosity and resilience began to reassert themselves. "She's a remarkable woman," Samuel Harrison observed one evening as they made camp beside a stream. Caleb looked across the camp to where Evangeline was helping other women prepare the evening meal, her movements efficient and graceful despite obvious fatigue. Tommy played nearby with other children, his laughter a sound that had been absent for too long. "Yes, she is," Caleb agreed. It was during the 4th week of travel that the past finally caught up with them. Caleb had been riding scout ahead of the main column when he spotted the dust cloud that announced approaching riders. His heart sank as he recognized the disciplined formation and purposeful advance that marked professional pursuers rather than casual travelers. He spurred his horse back toward the wagon train, his mind already working through defensive options that ranged from poor to desperate. The terrain offered little natural protection, and a wagon train loaded with families was hardly equipped for sustained battle against determined professionals. He found Harrison near the head of the column, studying a hand-drawn map. The wagon master looked up as Caleb approached, immediately reading the urgency in his expression. "How many?" Harrison asked without preamble. 8, maybe 10. Professional cavalry, moving fast." Harrison folded the map with practiced efficiency. "Options?" Caleb looked ahead to where the trail wound between rocky outcroppings that offered the possibility of defensive positions. "We could ford up in those rocks ahead, try to discourage them from pressing an attack. And if they're not discouraged, then we'll hold them as long as we can," Caleb said, giving voice to a commitment that surprised him with its finality. What followed was a desperate hour of preparation as families who had never contemplated violence found themselves thrust into positions that would determine whether their children lived or died. Men who had been farmers and shopkeepers checked loads in hunting rifles, while women gathered children into the protected center of an improvised fortress made from overturned wagons and scattered boulders. Evangeline worked alongside the other women, helping to organize medical supplies and prepare areas where the wounded could be treated. But Caleb noticed that she also checked the loads in her pistol with practiced efficiency. "When this starts," Caleb told her, "you stay with Tommy in the center." But Evangeline was already shaking her head. "These people took us in when they didn't have to. I won't hide while they risk their lives because of my problems." The attacking force appeared at the mouth of the valley, riding hard but maintaining the kind of formation that spoke of military discipline and extensive experience. They reined in just beyond rifle range, close enough to demonstrate their presence, but far enough away to avoid immediate retaliation. Their leader was a different man than the one who had led the attack on Caleb's ranch, someone older and more experienced, with weathered competence that marked a career soldier who had found profitable employment in civilian pursuits. He sat his horse with casual authority while studying the defensive positions through a brass telescope. "Harrison," the man called out, "I'm Colonel Marcus Webb, representing certain business interests in Denver. I believe you have something that belongs to my employers." The use of military rank was clearly intended to establish authority and suggest organized backing that made resistance futile. But Harrison had served under fire himself, and he wasn't easily intimidated. "This is a lawful wagon train carrying legal immigrants," Harrison called back. "Anyone who interferes with our passage will answer to federal authorities." Webb's laughter carried an unpleasant edge. "Federal authorities are a long way from here, Harrison, and some debts supersede federal protection." The negotiation that followed was a careful dance around truths that everyone understood, but no one wanted to state directly. Webb wanted Evangeline returned to face the consequences of her husband's financial obligations. Harrison was obligated to protect the people under his care. Neither man was willing to back down. "You've got 1 hour to consider your options," Webb finally announced. "After that, we'll take what we came for." As the attacking force withdrew, Caleb found himself studying the faces of people who had signed on for a journey to Oregon but found themselves preparing for battle. Farmers and merchants, families with children, all of them now hostages to a conflict they had never asked to join. "There has to be another way," Evangeline said. "I can't let these people suffer because of my problems." "They made their choice when they accepted you into the train," Harrison said. "Same as they'd make it for any of the other families here. That's what community means on the frontier." When Webb's force finally moved to attack, they came with precision and coordination that marked professional cavalry executing a planned assault. But they also came against defenders who were fighting for something more valuable than money or military objectives. They were fighting for the right to build new lives in a place where the mistakes of the past couldn't follow. The battle that erupted was brief but savage, a concentrated explosion of violence that tested everyone's courage and resolve. Caleb found himself moving between defensive positions, helping to coordinate fields of fire while trying to minimize casualties among defenders who were brave but inexperienced. The turning point came when one of Webb's flanking maneuvers brought his men within range of Evangeline's position near the medical station. She had positioned herself where she could treat wounded while maintaining a clear field of fire, and when 3 riders broke through the outer defensive line, her rifle spoke with deadly accuracy. The sight of a woman defending the wagon train with the skill of a veteran soldier seemed to galvanize the other defenders. What had begun as desperate defensive action transformed into something approaching coordinated counterattack as farmers and merchants discovered reserves of courage they hadn't known they possessed. Webb himself fell when his horse stumbled during a charge against the main defensive position, sending him tumbling into range of multiple rifles. The loss of their leader broke the attackers' coordination, turning organized assault into confused retreat as surviving mercenaries decided that no amount of money was worth facing this level of determined resistance. As silence returned to the valley, Caleb surveyed the aftermath of a battle that should never have been necessary. 3 defenders had been killed, but they had won. More importantly, they had proven something to themselves about what they were capable of when circumstances demanded everything they had to give. That evening, as the train made camp beside a stream, Evangeline sought out Caleb where he sat alone on a boulder overlooking the peaceful valley. The contrast between the day's violence and the serene beauty of the Montana landscape seemed almost impossible to reconcile. "It's over," she said, settling beside him. "This part is over," Caleb agreed, "but we've still got 1,000 miles of trail ahead of us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind mountains that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in weeks, they could rest without constantly watching for pursuit. "Caleb," Evangeline said finally, her voice carrying a quality he had never heard before, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said before." He turned to look at her, seeing something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. There was resolve in her green eyes, a decision that had been building through all the shared dangers and mutual dependence of the past weeks. "When this journey ends," she continued, "when we reach Oregon and start building new lives, I want you to know that I'd be honored if you'd consider building yours with me." The proposal hung between them like morning mist, fragile and beautiful and completely unexpected. Caleb had been so focused on survival that he hadn't allowed himself to think beyond the immediate challenges of the trail. "Evangeline," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "are you certain? After everything that's happened?" "I'm certain because of everything that's happened." She reached out to take his hand. "You gave up everything to help us. Your home, your life, everything you'd built." A woman notices things like that. "I'm not a young man," he said. "I'm not wealthy, and after what happened at the ranch, I don't have much to offer." "And courage," Evangeline added, "and kindness, and the kind of steadiness that makes a woman feel safe in an unsafe world." She was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the fading light. "I loved my first husband, but I was young and foolish. Now I'm older, and I know the difference between romantic dreams and the kind of partnership that can survive anything the world throws at it. And you think we could have that kind of partnership? I think we already do." The truth of that statement settled over them, encompassing all the shared dangers and mutual support that had brought them to this moment. They had already been tested in ways that most couples never experienced. "Then yes," Caleb said, raising her hand to his lips. "Yes, I'll marry you." Evangeline's smile transformed her face, erasing the lines of worry and replacing them with pure joy. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." They were married 3 days later by Samuel Harrison, who possessed the legal authority to perform ceremonies as an appointed territorial magistrate. The wedding took place beside a clear mountain stream, with the entire wagon train serving as witnesses and the vast Montana sky providing a cathedral more magnificent than any human construction. The ceremony itself was simple, focusing on practical vows that acknowledged the realities of frontier life. When Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle and tentative, the beginning of something new rather than the culmination of a long courtship. As the festivities wound down and families began preparing for another early start, Caleb found himself standing with his new wife at the edge of the camp, looking ahead toward mountains that still blocked their view of Oregon Territory. "Any regrets?" he asked. Evangeline considered the question seriously. "About leaving my old life behind? About the dangers we've faced? About marrying a man I've known for less than 2 months? Any of it. All of it. No regrets," she said firmly. "This feels like the beginning of something good. Something real." They stood together in comfortable silence, husband and wife now, partners in a venture that would test everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The veteran rancher and the widow who had offered him her hand would complete their journey together, building a life that honored both the courage it had taken to begin again and the love that had made it all worthwhile.